At SOC, we always begin on a happy note. Dobrodošli svima. Thank you very much for coming along to this celebration of Margaret Thatcher's 100th, the birth 100 years ago. The language of this conference is going to be polite. No, and the language of this conference is going to be English. But first I will say something in Croatian. Dobrodošli. Gospođa Margaret Thatcher, na kraju barunica Thatcher, jako joj se previše nije sviđao ovaj pompozni naslov, je bila očigledno britanska državnica i svjetska državnica, stvarna međunarodna figura. Zato je ova stogodišnjica njenog rođendana imala odjeka od Washingtona do Budimpešte i Praga i ponajviše naravno u Londonu. Ali Margaret Thatcher je bila važna i za nas, i za Hrvatsku. Ona je dosljedno borila za pravo hrvatskog naroda da ima vlastitu državu. Uporno je naglašavala temeljno pravo Hrvatske na samoobranu, što je značilo prekidanja embarga i dobivanja oružja i istinski je brinula za sve žrtve velikosrpske agresije. Obično ljude koji su bili ljude ovog rata. Ona je bila žestoko kritizirana za to, ponajviše u Engleskoj. I ja ću reći nešto o tome. Došla je samo jedan put u Hrvatsku, to je bilo 1998. godine, ali joj je ovaj posjet bio vrlo važan i pri srcu, događaj pun emocije, ponajviše u Vukovaru, pred grobljem užasnog pokolja. Postala je počasna građanka grada Zagreba i poslije je govorila, slično kao Kennedy u Berlinu, ja mogu sada sa ponosom tvrditi, ja sam Zagrebčanka. Zato je Zagreb dobar prostor za ovo slavlje. Hvala. Well, 100 years ago, on the 13th of October, Margaret Hilda Roberts, the future Margaret Thatcher, was born in the flat above her father's groceries store in Grantham. She wasn't born in poverty, but she was certainly, as they say, in modest circumstances and with no great prospects. And she would, against all odds, change her country and in many ways change the rest of the world overwhelmingly for the better. And it's right to honor her memory as we are doing today. She was a good friend to me and to others here and to our different countries, as we'll recall. Now, I shall introduce in a minute our distinguished speakers, but I'd first like to welcome by name one or two other guests who are with us. I would like to mention in particular two former Croatian foreign ministers, very good friends of Centar za obnovu kulture, Davor Stier and Miro Kovač. Hvala. I would like to welcome the Ministers' Council, the two Ministers' Council and their colleague from the Embassy of Slovenia. I would like to extend a particular welcome to Dr. Ajla Čustović, a representative of the Islamic community in Croatia. Hvala. And on perhaps the same note, I could recall that Cardinal Bozanic, who was not able himself to come, but who had a long and productive conversation with Mrs. Thatcher when she came in 1998, passed on his best wishes for the celebration of the achievements and life of what he calls Britain's great Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. So thank you to him too. Well, Now our speakers. Well, I'm delighted that my old friend and trusted Thatcher loyalist, John O'Sullivan, there he is. Where is he? There he is. John O'Sullivan, president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, has joined us, and that he's accompanied by his charming wife, Melissa. John and I are, I think, the last remaining regular Thatcher speechwriters still alive. She wore out all the rest. But we are still going strong, well, more or less. John has combined a life in journalism in Britain and America with that of high-level political advisor, and he is now running one of Central Europe's most important think tanks. And he has also eaten in the best restaurants in the world. So he is a source of much useful information. Thank you for coming. Keith Miles, our fellow Brit, is another of those that we on the right in Britain call sound. I'm not sure whether that has any translation in any other language, but he is sound. He is a chartered accountant and has been a finance director of large companies, but also of the Institute of Economic Affairs, the IEA, which is the world's oldest think tank. He's accompanied by his wife Slava, whom I'm delighted to see again. She is Slovenian. And this connection with, on the one hand, the IEA, and on the other, Slovenia, and Keith brilliantly represented Slovenia in Britain during and after its independence struggle, really explains how he and I got to know one another. Because it was he who organized at the IEA the first meeting of those of us, Croats and non-Croats, who came together in 1991 to campaign for the recognition and assistance of Croatia. He is a friend of Croatia indeed. Marek Matrasek, who is the chairman of his own public affairs company in Warsaw, is a British-born Pole. Now, the Poles and the British, I should say, have some kind of special affinity, of which Mrs. Thatcher, among others, was also deeply conscious. Her visits to Poland before and after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and before and after she was Prime Minister, or during and after she was Prime Minister, were always, the only word I can use is electric. Marek was working against communism when it mattered, and he then became the representative of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation in the region. Close to the late Roger Scruton, he's part of what we might call, if only to arouse leftist paranoia, the conservative intellectual and philosophical network. Thank you for coming. In the second panel, we come to those who were in close contact with Margaret Thatcher during the crisis and wars that ripped apart the former communist Yugoslavia and eventually led to new democratic sovereign states emerging from the ruins. I'm particularly honored to welcome Dr. Mate Granic. Dr. Granic served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Croatia between 1993 and the year 2000. He is now advisor to the current Prime Minister of Croatia, Mr. Andrej Plenković. Dr. Granic, under the leadership of President Tudjman, navigated stormy seas that often looked like sinking Croatia for good. His books, I should say, are indispensable reading for those who wish to understand what happened. Margaret Thatcher had the highest regard for him, both for his judgment and his integrity, and rightly so. Thank you for coming. Alojz Peterle was Prime Minister at the time of Slovenia's brief but dangerous struggle for independence. Thankfully, Slovenia did not then endure what Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina endured, but I know that he appreciated Mrs. Thatcher's support in the crisis, and she had a high regard for him, and he will tell us more. Thank you. Dr. Eyüp Ganic, who is by background an engineer, educated at MIT, held various political posts, but he was continuously, between 1990 and 1996, a member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. and under President Izetbegović, one of the key Bosniak leaders. He retired from politics and founded the Sarajevo School of Science and Technology. This is the most successful private university in the region. Its prestige is confirmed by the fact that its degrees are uniquely authorized by the Independent University of Buckingham in the UK. Eyüp Garnić met Mrs. Thatcher under circumstances that he will certainly describe when he got out to Switzerland, Gstaad, where she was working with me and others on her memoirs. And he got out in the back of a Red Cross plane in August 1992, leaving Sarajevo to come and ask for her help. Well, she listened to him, she liked him, she trusted him, they became friends, and what was most important at that point, she fed him. John O'Sullivan and I were there to see the transformation. It was great. Thank you for coming. After Eyüp Garnić left, and then filled with angry resolve, she got down to preparing the New York Times article that we'll see in a minute. Drago Stambuk, who was Croatia's very able and hard-working diplomatic representative in the UK during Croatia's War of Independence and its aftermath, is unfortunately not able to join us. He too had a warm friendship with Mrs. Thatcher, who liked and trusted him, and that certainly helped Croatia. And I shall read out a shortened version of what Drago would have said later. Well, there'll be two roundtable discussions. I'll chair the first, and my colleague Mate Ćurić, ZOC's General Secretary, who does in fact everything of any importance in this organization at all, since I'm usually in Samobor, he will chair the second. So let me turn to the substance of what I want to say just in these opening remarks. Well, events elsewhere, Britain, Hungary, Brussels, Prague, I believe, the USA, I'm assured, and now here in Zagreb, these testify to the fact that Mrs. Thatcher has enormous historical importance. But it is important that she should be celebrated here. And let me explain why. She had only been twice to Yugoslavia. She went once with Fitzroy MacLean in opposition, where, like all other visiting politicians, she was expected to demand from Tito the release of Milovan Djilas, to the best of my knowledge without any effect whatsoever. And the second occasion was at the time of Tito's funeral, which many of you will have seen, what I consider one of the most extraordinarily funny films that has ever been produced in Yugoslavia, where all of these international statesmen are heaving, their shoulders are heaving with grief. Their handkerchiefs cannot really be removed from their nose and eyes. And at one point there, we have Mrs. Thatcher, who didn't cry very much. She is meant to be heaving with grief about the death of Drug Tito. But anyway, that was the only other time that she came to Yugoslavia. The crisis in the former Yugoslavia, we might say, was the second big test of what George Bush had inauspiciously described as the New World Order. The first, of course, was the Gulf War, which we can leave aside, except that it involved the United States to such an extent that it wasn't able to get involved until several years later in this part of the world. And the other, of course, was this war in former Yugoslavia. This was meant to be the war that Europe was going to solve. You may remember the otherwise not very memorable Jacques Pousse describing it as the hour of Europe. Well, this hour of Europe was a shambles and a disgrace. So this was a test of the New World Order, but it was a test of something else. And this mattered to her. It was a test of conscience. And in both respects, both as regards order and as regards conscience, morality, the international community in general, and Britain in particular, spectacularly failed. And it would have been very easy for her to go down the wrong route. In the Conservative Party, the sympathy was overwhelming with the Serbs, particularly on the right of the party. This was partly, I think, because of romanticized and inaccurate images of Draža Mihailović and the Chetniks. It was partly, of course, because of living with communism was a comfortable thing to do. But it was also because at the time, we might say, there was a German-based interpretation of events. And that is to say, and she held this, that the reunification of Germany after the fall of communism meant that Germany was now a great threat, and therefore almost everything was seen in the light of German advance against the rest of the world, including, of course, if we were obsessed with the Second World War, British interests. Well, what I'm saying really is that it would have been very likely that she would have fallen for that. And the question as to why she didn't, well, there are various answers. But I think that, I've been thinking about this, I think the most important answer is from her family background. That her family, they were right-wing, they were conservative, very strongly religious, Methodists in Grantham. But one of the things that they really held to was they were very strongly against the appeasement of dictators and looking kindly on the use of force. She had a very strong sense of justice and compassion, and she saw what was happening in this part of the world, in my view, through the eyes of somebody who opposed appeasement of those who wished to use force rather than right to get their way. I want to also share with you something about the scale of the political pressure which there was from the government, Conservative government, and the Conservative Party itself on her personally at this point. And I saw this. It was sustained, it was brutal, and it was crude. Malcolm Rifkind, then Defense Secretary, later Foreign Secretary, he described her calls for action to help Srebrenica as, I quote, emotional rubbish. Let us remember, the genocide of Srebrenica, several years before that, the British thought it was emotional rubbish to be worried about Srebrenica. She was deliberately humiliated and insulted, for example, at a lunch organized by a government minister, she thought was a friend of hers, who was married at that juncture before going to prison to a Serb. She was insulted there by a young MP, who I'm pretty sure was in the pay of the Russians, and told basically that she was an ignoramus. Now, I remember how upset she was afterwards, coming back to me and talking to me about it, and I was able to tell her that everything she said was correct. The British government also insulted Senator Robert Dole, a very important person for Croatia, when he came to put the case for lifting the arms embargo and airstrikes, lift and strike as it was called, and the two exchanged experiences in her office. The British government was the main international force putting the case for the Serbs at every stage. Now, Serbian influence was everywhere. It was at levels of government, it was at the levels of business, but I want to just share with you just how deep and far it was. And of course, what this tells one, both, of course, about the previous extent of Yugoslav penetration into Britain and also Serbian, the number of Serbs who were there in different positions. I remember at my club being approached by a Yugoslav speaking perfect English, which I found immediately suspect. Most of the Croats could hardly put 3 words together, I'm afraid. And he turned out to be I think he was the Serbian Yugoslav chargé d'affaires, who was coming to put me right about everything. I hadn't asked him, but he did. And then I remember one night at a Russian restaurant, now closed, called the Luba's Bistro in Yeoman's Way, and sitting down at this table. It was cheap, that was the main thing for it. Sitting down there and shooting my mouth off, I expect, about what was happening in Yugoslavia. And then a substantially endowed waitress came and sat by the side of me without invitation. These were benches. And she said, "I think you wish to learn Serbian." I said, "Well, I don't really. I mean, I'm quite interested in Croatia, but I don't really particularly want to learn." She said, "I have lots of interesting papers you can see about Serbia." Well, I said, "Well, I really, I just don't think." So, I felt that more was being offered, I have to say, than papers. so I just stuck to the borscht. Anyway, they were everywhere. Now, Mrs. Thatcher was subject to influence, but not that sort of influence. And she was the one who decided whom to trust. Well, we'll hear from Stambuk that she listened to him, but she was also surrounded by extremely knowledgeable people, and she had a good eye for who was to be trusted and listened to and who wasn't. And the two people I would most mention, really, are Christos Veitch and Sir Noel Malcolm. She sought more advice. She always wanted advice. There was no limit to her desire to know more, hear more, be more informed, and then, of course, to act. She was visited by many people from this area. As well as those who are with us today, she had discussions, for example, with people who really fit into no political category, just to name a few. And those of you who know these people will know that they do not fit into any political category. There was the Bosnian Serb general Jovan Divjak. There was President Tudjman's first defense minister and later bitter opponent, General Martin Spiegelj. There was the left-wing French intellectual Bernard-Henri Lévy. There was Ibrahim Rugova, the self-styled president of Kosovo, always wearing his scarf. And I hope it won't shock his admirers to know that among them was also the anti-fascist journalist and publisher Slavko Goldstein. Well, I just say, I wonder how many other Westerners made such an effort to stay informed. Ultimately, though, she relied on her instinct and on her basic principles. These were three, really. First, the quick, overwhelming use of force was what should be required. She and Reagan, not like Bush, she and Reagan believed in that, as it's sharply in and sharply out. She believed that if British and American airstrikes had been made against the advancing columns of tanks from Serbia in August, that would have stopped the matter, and I think she was right. Secondly, she believed that nations have the right to self-determination and self-defense, and that was exactly the basic principle on which she argued for the next few years. Thirdly, she thought that artificial multinational structures, especially those constructed under communism, were not likely to survive when put under pressure. A view she had to modify, of course, in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we hope Bosnia and Herzegovina will survive, though no one can be sure. But ultimately what defined her attitude, I would say, was her humanity, her pity, and her hatred of injustice. Well, we're now going to have a short film, and before it goes up, let me just say something about it, since they're very enthusiastic to put up this film. Well, what we're going to see are a few bits and pieces, extracts of this, that, and the other, which I think have relevance. The first, though, not great quality film, but very important, was her first intervention, December 1991, on television, recorded, I think, by Hrvatska Radio Televizija, calling for recognition of the Croatian state and the arming of the Croats. Now, Charles Powell, her former advisor, was rung up by a desperate British Foreign Office. It got him up at 4 o'clock in the morning, Macau time, to ring Mrs. Thatcher to beg her not to say what she was going to say. But she said it. She said it. Then we moved to Bosnia, and there is the article you'll see that she wrote for the New York Times in August 1992 while we were in Gstaad. This was drafted by Christos Veitch, John O'Sullivan, and me. It's a very strong piece demanding, as well as the lifting of the arms embargo on Bosnia, the bombing of sites in Serbia unless aid was let through. That was regarded as horrific by the international community, let alone the Foreign Office. We then have another interview on television, CNN, I think it is. And then in November 1993, there was a further article in the New York Times. But I want to go back to the circumstances of this of this first New York Times interview, which was really quite interesting. Jelačić had gone off well-fed to, well, relatively well-fed to Sarajevo, as far as I know. But the article was published, and then we looked at coverage in America, and we looked around her table at George Bush being asked about it. Now, before he could offer anything unrehearsed, Lawrence Eagleburger, a suspicious character if there ever was one, leant forward and muttered, already too many arms there. So, in fact, that ended any chance that Bush was actually going to say, well, perhaps the Bosnians should be armed, and Bush wobbled back into the State Department line. Well, Mrs. Thatcher looked at us afterwards and she said, that was a fat lot of use. And it was. Well, finally, we have a photo of her sitting after leaving office, and when she started to become really quite unwell, sitting with friends, those who became friends, Chelsea Hospital war veterans. She was a friend and supporter of that hospital. And you could see their splendid uniforms. They were just her sort of people. She was their sort of people, and that's where she's buried. And then at the end, there are a few minutes of her funeral procession with the coffin borne on its gun carriage to St. Paul's Cathedral. Queen was inside, crowds were outside, and you can hear those crowds cheering, though of course, being Britain, there is an occasional boo. All I would say is that the significance here is that, as with President Tudjman's funeral, hers demonstrated that ordinary people have more love and respect for great leaders than the global community could imagine or would wish. Thank you.
I shall continue myself to put their case and put it as forcibly as I can. I have spoken either in this country or in the United States. At first, people had been given to understand, wrongly, that it was just a question, serious as though that is, of civil war between two different groups. They needed to be informed that it was between communist Serbia, who has taken control both of the army and of the country, and democratic Croatia and Slovenia, both of whom had exercised their right to become independent. I then duly explain that Croatia and Slovenia have no army. They have only got the weapons they can capture and the ones they can get hold of, and they are entitled to a right of self-defense against those who attack them. I said early to people over whom I would have hoped to have had some influence that I thought, as the hostilities got worse and worse, and more Croatians were being killed and massacred, that it would have been right to recognize Croatia and Slovenia as independent. Then we should have been in a position to supply them legally with arms with which to defend themselves, and they would have been in a very much better position, and what is more, Serbia would have known the position the world was taking. Unfortunately, that has not happened, but there are many, many friends of Croatia. Now the situation is more fully realized. The figures of deaths need to be better known. In the earlier days, I was saying to people there have been over 1,000 Croatians murdered or massacred, and that is 4 times as many as we lost in regaining the Falklands, and twice as many as the whole of the Allies lost in the Gulf in regaining Kuwait. And also that those figures have now gone up, and I have just been reliably informed that it is about 15,000 Croatians. That is an enormous number, fighting for liberty, who have been killed. And I know from the radio that there are hundreds of thousands of people who've been driven from their homes, and the towns and cities levelled, and ancient monuments and churches attacked. All of these I'm trying to get over to people who, when you speak to them, are amazed at the situation. In face of that, there have been many meetings of politicians in the European community, many ceasefires. Nothing they have done has been effective. There's been once to the Security Council. It's difficult to get across the awfulness of what is happening there. We shall continue, because I think now that many people know the Adriatic coast, and that means that they have some kind of personal touch and contact with them. But I must make it quite clear, in my view, the West should be on the side of liberty and democracy and justice. And the more we can get home to people the true situation, and this is happening in the heart of Europe, and that the cries of the Croatian people are not being heard, the more we can awaken them to the true position. I should say, by way of comfort, that there are now a number of organizations who are trying to help the Croatians with practical help, and I shall continue myself to put their case and put it as forcibly as I can.
None of us have done enough with regard to Bosnia. It is a disgrace to all politicians. The United Nations recognizes, it didn't invent, but recognizes the right to self-defense. And it was absolutely absurd that then it passed a resolution denying the Bosnians the arms with which to defend themselves. Crazy.
Do you criticize England?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do. Oh, it was in 1992 that I was so disgusted that I did a television performance and said, you're not entitled to deny people the right to defend themselves. Supposing when Winston had written to Roosevelt and said, please give us the tools and we'll finish the job, Roosevelt had said, oh, but there'll be more killing.
Inside, outside, inside, outside.
and may she rest in peace. We'll now move on to our first panel. I'd just like to say before we do that I'm very pleased that we have with us Mrs. Lara Romano, who is Secretary of the Cabinet of the Minister of Croatian Foreign Affairs, Dr. Grlić Radman, and we're honored and gratified to have you with us. Thank you very much.